All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So I am Mallory Harris. I was the finance officer for Scientists Speak Up, which is a graduate student organization at Stanford focused on countering misinformation about science. And I think a lot of the time there's this assumption that misinformation looks unscientific and that the communities that are spreading it simply don't care what the science has to say. But as we were studying this and having conversations on these topics, we came to this potentially counterintuitive realization that a lot of the time, these counter-consensus communities who are disagreeing with the consensus, whether it's about climate change or COVID-19 vaccines, are selectively and potentially deceptively citing scientific literature as evidence for their own views, which creates this really complicated dynamic then where the very people who are attacking and potentially undermining the scientific consensus are doing so in a way that appears scientific. And as scientists, your own work might get misused or misrepresented to advance these counter-consensus views in a way that the work might not actually support. So I thought it would be important to put these researchers who have been studying the way these dynamics play out in front of our group of scientists to have a conversation about how this works and what we might do about it. So with that, I'm going to give you a run of show. We're going to hear from each of our panelists. They'll give a brief presentation on the work they've been doing in this realm, and then we'll open things up for questions. And I'd really like to invite folks joining us to leave their questions in the chat. And then lastly, I'll just note that this is being recorded and we're planning to share it on our YouTube channel afterwards. So with that, our first speaker is Alexandros Evstrachiou, a PhD candidate at UCL's Department of Computer Science and Center for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity. His work focuses on how social processes like polarization and trust dynamics influence the spread of and belief in misinformation from a computational social science perspective. As part of this research, he has explored how scientific consensus is misrepresented on social media platforms by selectively focusing on favorable experts or academic papers. So Alex, you can take it away and we'll turn off our camera. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks for that introduction, Mallory. So yeah, don't let the long name scare you. You can all call me Alex. That is absolutely fine. So can everybody see the slides? Okay.
Yep.
Great. So today I'll be talking to you mainly about scientific consensus on COVID-19 and how that was misrepresented. But before getting into the depth of it, I kind of wanted to spend a few minutes talking about how I started researching this thing. So back in 2021, I was working as a volunteer fact checker back in my home country of Cyprus. And essentially the motivation behind that initiative to fact check pieces was the COVID-19 pandemic. So we were actually doing quite a lot of work on COVID-19 pieces specifically. And we drew quite a bit of attention from people that kind of disagreed with the idea that COVID is a massive issue, that disagreed with the idea of COVID vaccinations. And a lot of these people were referring to this one particular name called Luc Montagnier. For those of you that don't know Luc Montagnier, he was a French virologist. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2022, who was also a Nobel laureate in medicine. He won the prize in 2008 for his work on HIV and AIDS. Now, Luc Montagnier, towards the end of his life, he kind of turned into a little bit of a scientific pariah. He started peddling a little bit of pseudoscientific perspectives around things like homeopathy, etc. And he did position himself quite staunchly against COVID vaccinations. Now, when we were witnessing all of these comments coming in, talking about Luc Montagnier, we had this thought, of whether he was really the only person that actually positioned himself, the only Nobel laureate that positioned himself against COVID-19 vaccines, or in actually said anything at all about COVID vaccines. And so what we did was we went out and we searched for any kind of public statement from any Nobel laureate in medicine around COVID vaccines. And what we were able to find was that it was actually only Luc Montagnier that specifically opposed COVID vaccinations. But we're actually able to find 24 other names that won this prize that actually positioned themselves pro-vaccines. So they either made public appearances supporting vaccination, urging people to get vaccinated, or just trying to urge governments to expand vaccination regimens. The interesting part is that actually this first name right here, Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, she won the prize with Luc Montagnier for the same work. They worked in the same lab. They co-authored the same papers. And so the next thing on our mind when we saw these 24 names, it was, okay, why do we only keep seeing Luc Montagnier pop up? Is it really because we're working on fact checking and it's just kind of our own little biased echo chamber, or is this kind of a quantifiable phenomenon? And so we turned to Twitter and we collected a lot of data, basically any kind of tweet that mentioned these people in the context of any virus or COVID-19 or coronavirus. And what we observed was that during, well, before the pandemic, actually, before this kind of line right here, we actually saw that Luc Montagnier, this red faint line down here on the ground, he wasn't really being mentioned at all. Instead, what we saw were spikes every September for all of the other names. And essentially what these spikes correspond to is the Nobel Prize account, the official Nobel Prize Twitter account, mentioning these names to announce the winners for that year. That was basically it. But post-COVID, we actually saw quite a few spikes for Luc Montagnier popping up throughout. And these spikes actually corresponded to public appearances of Montagnier, who appeared mainly on French TV news, speaking against COVID vaccines. And then those kinds of appearances would be taken up by US alternative media and kind of translated and then spread out across the English-speaking world as well. And so what we saw here was that there was a misrepresentation of generally who the experts are around this, because essentially the public was using Montagnier because of his Nobelist status, but ignoring other people that had the kind of same laureate status. And our next thought was, okay, if this is happening with experts specifically, is it also happening with scientific sources? So scientific papers specifically. And just to give you an example of what I mean, really the question here is, are people talking about good science because they think it's good science, or are they just talking about science that they like? So exactly what Mallory said towards the beginning. And this is an example of a tweet. This person is saying that he was called a misinformation spreader because they said that COVID vaccines are not safe. Here's a paper that shows I was right. Do you believe me now? So I should probably place a bracket there and say that the author of this tweet is also one of the authors of the paper. So there is a little bit of, I suppose, bias maybe there. But regardless, we get a reply from another user that says, okay, so you'll trust the meta-analysis of 58 studies I can send you, or do you just want to cherry pick one? And this cherry picking aspect is really what we're trying to get to here. I should also say that misrepresentations of science are not a new thing. So Cook et al. Back in 2013, they published a study on anthropogenic climate change. It was actually a landmark study that came up with this figure of 97% of published research on climate change supports anthropogenic man-made climate change. And so we had these kinds of figures from before, but again, Twitter disagrees, right? So here we see a more recent example. This was actually this January in 2024 of two people sharing an Epoch Times article that supposedly says, all of this consensus ideas was based on faulty climate change data. And I want to draw your attention here to this climate experts part. Who are the climate experts, right? We have quantifiable figures of scientific consensus, but then there's this obfuscation around, well, other climate experts say this other thing. So, how correct can this consensus idea be? And even in the anti-vaccination movement, this is a paper as early as 2012. So Kata had this to say back in 2012. The tactics and tropes that the anti-vaccination movement uses are things like skewing science, shifting hypotheses, censoring dissent, and attacking critics. And very interestingly, back then, they also frequently made claims such as not being anti-vaccine, but pro-safe vaccines. And so I kind of want to invite you all to think about how many times you've heard this line of argumentation with COVID vaccine specifically. How many times you've heard people saying, I'm not anti-vaccination, I'm anti-COVID vaccination because supposedly these vaccines are not safe. So what we're seeing is actually a lot of fringe ideas now gaining a lot of popularity exactly because of the pandemic. And this is where our work kind of comes in. And we broadly posed two main questions, right? So the first one is scientific consensus around COVID-19 actually misrepresented on social media, and the quantification of this, and also what are people's motivations when they're publicly discussing COVID-19 science? And to get around to these questions, we essentially collected 25,000 preprints from bioRxiv and medRxiv. These are basically preprint servers on biological and medical fields. They were all of the COVID-19 preprints available to us at the time, these 25,000. And then we looked at Twitter and we tried to collect all of the tweets that talked about any of these 25,000 papers. And so we ended up with a data set of nearly 1.25 million tweets from nearly 350,000 users. And when we looked at the papers, we found that they essentially talked about a lot of different topics and categories, but we focused on four main categories that we spotted as being very, very talked about on Twitter. And these were vaccines, non-pharmaceutical interventions like mask wearing, lockdowns, etc., COVID-19 dangers such as mortality and long COVID, and also drugs, whether they are prophylactic or therapeutic. Now, when we looked at these categories, what we actually found was that for each of these categories, the scientific consensus was very pro-official guidelines. Okay, so in the context of vaccines, for example, the scientific evidence base largely supported the efficacy and the safety of vaccines. But Twitter did not really represent this reality. I will again draw your attention specifically to the vaccines topic because it is by far the most glaring example. But what we actually spotted was that only 4.2% of papers actually challenged the efficacy or the safety or something about vaccines in general, but 45.4% of all of the tweets talking about vaccines were mentioning that 4.2% of the papers. So we see this massive, massive focus just on the subset of papers, and this creates a false consensus, if you like, or discrepancy factor of over 10 times between public consensus and scientific consensus. And this, of course, we observed this for all of the different categories, but this was by far the most glaring example. And so really the take-home point here is that there is a severe misrepresentation of scientific consensus around COVID-19 on Twitter. And what you can see here on your screens is the retweet network of all the people that participated in the scientific discussions. This kind of red cluster on the left-hand side, that shows the anti-consensus community, essentially, which amounted to 30% of the entire network. That is quite substantial. Now, unfortunately, this is still ongoing. So the most recent example actually took place in June this year. So a paper came out claiming a causal relationship between vaccinations and excess deaths, excess mortality. Now, this data was purely speculative and correlational. There was no real causal mechanism in there at all. And so this paper was widely criticized by the scientific community, but that did not really stop it from accumulating 15,000 and counting social media mentions and being mentioned by nearly 100 different news outlets. Now, BMJ, which published this article, had to come out and publish an expression of concern, essentially putting the record straight, saying that there was no causal relationship here. And in fact, the excess deaths are probably being caused by COVID-19 itself, but still this paper is actually still being circulated. And I just want to conclude with some of the things that we're currently contending with. So the first one is whether false consensus is actually fully organic, or is there actually a coordinated or an authentic effort to contribute or amplify this kind of idea of false consensus? And the second one is what is actually the role of news media, influencers, and public figures in this? And crucially, what is the direction of the influence between these entities and the public? So is it the public motivated these entities to actually talk about these papers because there's appetite for them? Or are these entities serving these papers to the public on a silver platter? And I'm just going to stop there and just hand the stage to Rod.
Awesome. Thank you. That was super interesting. So our next speaker is going to be Abhari. He's a PhD candidate in the School of Communication at Northwestern University. His research studies the antecedents of science conspiracies and their consequences for scientific credibility. And recently, he has documented the rise of conspiracies about scientific retractions during COVID-19. So Rod, you can take it away.
All right, excellent. Hello, everyone. So I will share my screen. Yeah, so today I want to talk to you about my research on retractions and scientific misinformation. So one of the conspiracy theories I'm sure that we're all familiar with is the idea that COVID-19 was spread through 5G towers. This was a fairly popular theory of the virus transmission in the first few months of the pandemic. And actually, the belief was so strong, especially in the UK and parts of Europe, that 5G towers were vandalized and even burned in over 100 cases. So this was a fairly compelling a piece of scientific misinformation. And it was labeled as such on Facebook, and perhaps other social media sites sort of reliably saw that it was not true scientific theory, but essentially something that has been identified through the fact checkers as being false. But I wanted to kind of talk more about what it means to be science misinformation, because this is a term that became fairly popular during the pandemic. And Weston Bergstrom argued that science misinformation is essentially two types of misinformation. There's misinformation within science and misinformation about science. And so I want to talk about the distinction between the two. So within science, we can think of um, problems within the science academy. So scientific misconduct, for instance, can produce misinformation. So for instance, Andrew Wakefield had a famous paper about in 1998 about vaccines that was based on data that was essentially fabricated and not conducted. The methodology was unethical. But also there's significant errors that are consequential to the academic record, but may be accidental, right? We don't necessarily assume a motivation. Um, so that comes from within science. And then misinformation about science are things such as misunderstandings from how one reads a paper and takes away the wrong thing. Misapplications, which would be a lot of times extending the context of a paper, its limited findings to applications or contexts in which it doesn't actually apply. And of course, pseudoscience, so ideas that sound scientific but really aren't based in sound scientific research. So what do we think about this 5G conspiracy? Does it sound like science misinformation about science or misinformation within science? And I think the answer is that it's actually both. So that may be surprising if you assume that this was just a scientific conspiracy theory from non-scientists. But in fact, there was an article published called 5G Technology and Induction of Coronavirus in a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Biological Regulators and Homeostatic Agents. This isn't the most highly cited journal by any means, but it is a consistent paper, a journal with a that actually engages in the peer review process. So to quote from the abstract of this paper, they argue that in the research, they show that 5G waves could be absorbed by skin cells, acting like antenna, transferred to other cells, and play the main role in producing coronavirus in biological cells. So in retrospect, and probably at the time, this kind of sounds like nonsense. And it got retracted, right? And so there's good reasons for that retraction. But it's not the only retraction that's on our radar here. During the COVID pandemic, over 400 papers were retracted and counting. There are some papers that are still being retracted or given expressions of concern. And many of these papers were papers that were either hosted on preprint servers, in which case they often are removed without any explanation, right? Because they haven't been officially published, but they often circulate widely despite that. Or they're papers that were given expedited review through emergency COVID protocols. So I think it's easy to forget that many papers during COVID-19 were given essentially like less of a peer review, or the peer review went quicker. And this was sort of justified by the need to get information out quicker. And many of the top journals actually had some expedited policy. But there are consequences, and I argue that the spate of retractions we've been seeing may be related to the looser peer review protocols in particular, not to mention that many articles could just be posted on preprint servers without being peer reviewed at all. So I want to talk briefly about some of the claims of these papers. One of these papers, actually several, argued that face masks were ineffective, that vaccines kill 1 in every 1,000 people, and that was actually just due to a mathematical error. And then various alternative treatments, including acupuncture, are effective COVID-19 treatments. Right. So these are just the papers that we know about, right? The papers that were known to be problematic. There's plenty more that haven't been retracted. But the thing is that retracted papers tend to get more attention than non-retracted papers. And there's different reasons for this. This could be because the claims being made are sort of more sensational, generally speaking, and they're also a paper is more likely to be retracted if it gets mainstream attention, right? But one of the things I wanted to look at in my research is what is exactly being said about retracted papers and how does it change from before they get retracted to after the retraction. And so before the retraction, we might see, this is from our 5G paper we were looking at, that people share the article with a sort of sincere desire to engage in science, right? And a lot of times it validates their pre-existing worldviews, which is why they're sharing the paper. And then after the retraction, they may actually continue to share the article, right? There's nothing to prevent somebody from actually sharing an article after it's been retracted. And so we've seen that as well. So I want to talk briefly about what this misuse of retractions means. One of my research projects, we did a survey of roughly 5,000 post-retraction tweets from 37 articles. So these were tweets about articles after they've been retracted. And we saw that 21% of tweets just fully did not acknowledge the retraction. They may not have known about it or they may not have cared. And then 6% of those tweets, a smaller portion of the overall population, denied the legitimacy of the retraction. So it contested it, said, even if the paper is retracted, it's still true, or the retraction was not a legitimate one. And so as an example of the latter, we see a famous anti-vax doctor who himself has had the papers retracted, and he essentially says that it's cancel culture, right? Retractions are just an extension of censorship, right? So this really puts science in a bind, and it's what I want to what I've been researching after this project and what I want us to think more about is how can science proceed if the mechanism through which can correct itself is itself seen as a sign of weakness or misconduct. And it's particularly important because there are more retractions being put out in the last few years than at any other point in history. 2023 had the most retractions on record with over 10,000. But when trust in science is low, efforts to correct the scientific literature can often be seen themselves as a type of scientific misconduct through a conspiracist lens, right? Therefore, the scientific misinformation can proliferate from the very efforts designed to correct it. And so I want us to leave with 3 lessons. The first is that retractions show how misinformation within science can actually enable misinformation about science. And probably there could be more of a feedback loop as well, or maybe the boundaries between the two are not as clear cut as we once thought. Second, that the fast science practices during COVID were probably ill-advised, right? At least some of their practices in particular allowed low quality research to be produced. And then finally, I think there needs to be a greater attention to how retractions are conducted and what the retraction notice says to the public. And this isn't something I have time to talk about right now, but I'm happy to in the Q&A. But a lot of retraction notices provide insufficient detail about why a paper was retracted. And that actually poses a problem if you consider that people sincerely want to know why a paper that they've tweeted about became retracted at a later date. I think that can cause some of the confusion that we're seeing. All right, and so here's a bibliography. And yes, thanks. If you have any questions about these slides, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rod. So lastly, before we go into our Q&A, I'm going to turn it over to Anna Beers. As a reminder, you can go ahead and drop any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A tab. So Anna Beers researches how social media influencers affect political discourse on the internet. She is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Center for Information Technology and Public Life. And she received her Ph.D. from the University of Washington's Human-Centered Design and Engineering Department, where she worked on research projects relating to the COVID-19 pandemic, United States elections, and state-backed influence operations. She is particularly concerned with the way that communities of influencers work together to create and contest meaning around crisis events and in the collection and presentation of evidence in online spaces. All right, Anna.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Mallory. Let me get some slides up here. Yep. So this is all looking good to you. Just going to get my little bar out of the way.
Yeah, that's good.
And there we go. All right, yeah, thanks so much for having me to talk. I mean, after Rod and Alex's talk, I think you'll hear a lot more of the same. We're all trying to sort of get to this issue of why a seeming false consensus propagates on social media and elsewhere, and how that relates to the sort of infrastructure of science. My talk will be hitting the same notes. Mallory introduced me well. My name is Anna Beers. I'm at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. And what I'm going to present today is covering work I did recently titled Selective and Deceptive Citation in the Formation of Dueling Consensuses. If you want to read more about that work, you can see it published here at this article. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors, Sarah Nguyen, Kate Starbird, Jevin West, and Emma Spiro. And so maybe just as a way to jump into what my research and what this paper is about is I'll start with a claim, because that's what we're all always doing on the internet, is making claims. So here's my claim. Mass work. Maybe some of you share this belief. And why do I believe that mass work? Well, I'll give you a few reasons, because I've looked at the science. There are plenty of literature reviews sharing that mass work. There are sort of these mechanistic in the lab studies where they like blow droplets through a mask. That shows that mass work too. They measure whether people actually get the disease after wearing a mask. That works. They have these public health studies of when masks are actually sort of in the wild, quote unquote. Do they work? It seems to be, the answer is yes. They even have individual case studies. They watch what happens when one person wears a mask in a hair salon and another doesn't, and no surprise, masks prevent COVID. And we know that there's a lot of misleading science out there on the internet, right? So as we've seen from the previous two presentations, you might have seen something online that suggests that masks don't work. This Tucker Carlson here is quoting a paper, but that paper was actually contradicted by its author later. The author supports masks, and there's a paper over here that was published, but then subsequently corrected to say, like, we should have said more strongly that masks do work. And there are some papers that are doubtful of mask effectiveness, but they're old and they're published in low-impact journals, not really related to COVID-19. And then finally, we have, as Rod just talked so much about, the sort of retracted article. An article may suggest that masks don't work, but the authors later retract it. So I've talked with you a bit about masks. Let's pause and think about what I was doing here for a second. I told you what good science was, these studies on the left here. And I told you what sort of the bad science is, and these studies on the right here. And what I did was I drew a boundary between these things. I said, you got to trust this good science. It's telling you what the deal is with these masks, and you you got to ignore this bad science over here. There's problems with it. It's all flaws in all sorts of ways, and most of their authors don't stand by it anymore. Now it's, maybe you trust me and you trust my evaluation of that. And I sort of wish that everybody just listened to me in the world. But unfortunately, we live in a big world where everybody is talking all the time. And everybody's trying to figure out what good and bad science is. And they're sharing their perspectives on which is the good science and which is the bad science. And so in this study, we sort of designed a study to look at how people are chopping up good from bad science and how that led to the appearance of seemingly multiple scientific consensuses, in the social media wilds. And so to do this study, we collected a large data set, 38 million tweets of people arguing with each other in the Twitter replies about COVID-19 from about the first year of the pandemic, 2020 to 2021. 5 million of those tweets were specifically related to mask wearing, contained terms related to masks. And then we also compared those tweets with and then we took those tweets and we saw the citations that they were making, and we hand coded them, because sometimes people cite something positively as this is good science, and sometimes they say, don't read this is bad science, it's a negative citation. We coded citations made by the 81 most popular URLs shared in these replies. And then we also repeated the same process for highly cited mask peer-reviewed papers to see how sort of social media does citation differently from how peer-reviewed science does. Now, that was a lot of information. What does that actually look like in terms of this data set? Well, here's an example of somebody's tweet arguing with another person about whether masks work or not. They say, but I do care to point out the large amounts of info pointing to mask ineffectiveness / negligible effectiveness. Here's 3 URLs with peer-reviewed studies contained within, and they have these 3 URLs here. That's their evidence, right? And their evidence is supposed to be, and I have plenty more just to ask, their evidence is supposed to be showing that there's a consensus that masks don't work. And so let's check out what one of these links looks like. The Model Health Show. The Model Health Show is a podcast and various other media properties run by this man, Sean Stevenson. He's sort of a health influencer. He talks about COVID-19, especially when the pandemic was first happening. But he also does other things, maximize your potential and create a body and life you love. That's great. He has the Eat Smarter cookbook. He's sort of, has a sort of small business here providing advice about your health. And part of that business for him during the COVID-19 pandemic was telling people that masks don't work, and that collecting sort of science so that they can make their own decision about this. He made a, I think, 20-minute video, really high production value, walking through the studies and telling you why masks may or may not work. He then made a big website right below that. Here are a bunch of good science demonstrating an effectiveness of masks in surgery. And, we have 4 studies here. And we can sort of note those as A, B, C, and D. And to him, they're sort of all linked together, like this is the good science together. And then he also gives these explanations about the bad science. Here's popular mask effectiveness studies that ignore real-world conditions and demonstrate even more mask ineffectiveness upon further investigation. And then provides this long explanation for why this very well-cited PNAS study about the effectiveness of masks, for some reason, has some really big problems. And so we can sort of keep track of that too. We have studies A, B, C, and D. Those are our good studies. They're sort of related to each other with a positive relation because he put them all together. And then he contrasts them against study E, which is sort of on the other side of this scientific divide. This is called sign networks for the network scientists in the room. And it was not only him, it was a bunch of people doing this. Some people we really like, the Center for Disease Control would keep track of who sort of make similar explainer articles, or maybe NPR or a hospital, but also people who are a little bit more dubious, known conspiracy theorists like the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, or just random Twitter users whose posts kind of went relatively viral would be cited, or other sort of influencers who make their money from getting attention online would put these summary videos together walking you through the science, why face masks don't work according to science. So for this study, we wanted to compare, okay, Sean Stevenson and people like him, they cite science, right? How is the way that they cite science different from the way that scientists cite science? Are science communicators simply reproducing existing debates in the scientific world, or are they doing something else and citing in a very different pattern? And so, as part of our study, we made what I called sort of maps of scientific knowledge in the mind of science communicators, or how I term in the bottom right there, influencers, social media influencers, that kind of thing. And we see that when scientists write papers about mass, and the sort of information that they cite is generally split out by field. If you're a physicist studying the dynamics of water droplets, then you're going to cite sort of other physics papers. That's the physical experiments section. If you're an epidemiologist, you're going to cite epidemiology papers. If you're doing sort of public health research about how mass travel in hospitals, you're going to cite that kind of research. And they just sort of cite according to their field. And all three of these groups largely believe that masks are at least a little bit effective for preventing COVID-19. But science communicators, they cite science in a really different way, and that's not totally unexpected, right? Pro-mask science communicators, which includes the CDC, NPR, most hospitals, most trusted institutions, mainstream, usually trusted institutions, selectively cite evidence which suggests that masks work. And when they bring up other evidence, they sort of put it on the other side of the divide. They say, this is bad evidence, you should ignore it. But more critically, anti-mass science communicators, like the person we saw earlier, are also doing the same thing, citing articles individually to sort of give the impression that there are many articles that suggest the masks don't work. And if they cite any other articles at all, it's under the impression that there's a flaw with them. They're on the other side of the divide. In a sense, science communicators are taking a sort of raw matter of scientific publications and splitting and chopping them up and representing them to give these impressions that sort of the bulk of science shows something different. And as Alex said in his presentation, unfortunately, URL citing these papers were more shared in our data set. So these are URLs opposed to mass and often shared by these sort of dubious conspiracy theorists and health influencers. So to just wrap up here, science communicators, whether they be science journalists or conspiracy influencers, reshape our informational worlds, taking the raw matter of scientific discovery and forming it into apparent quote unquote consensus. And so the big question, which I don't answer here, I'm just going to ask questions, is how can we make our scientific infrastructure more resilient to such misappropriation? And I will conclude by just illustrating how hard that is. This is a screenshot I had earlier in the presentation. It's from a Tucker Carlson video. It's, little caption here, they knew masks were useless. This is a quote from a peer-reviewed study. A trial could be conducted in Vietnam of two-layered cotton cloth masks compared to medical masks showed a 13 times higher risk of infection in the cloth mask. The study suggests that cloth masks may increase the risk of infection, attributed to a study in Vietnam. Well, what is that study? I looked it up. It's a cluster randomized trial of cloth masks compared with medical masks in healthcare workers. And its conclusions and its abstract really suggest that this may be what they believe. Cloth masks should not be recommended, may result in increased risk of infection, etc. But the thing is, the author doesn't really believe that. The author is a huge advocate of masks. And how have they represented that? Well, they added a follow-up editor's note to the article, where they wrote this sort of bonus addition to this article. It's right at the top whenever you see it, that health workers are asking us if they should wear no mask at all. Cloth masks are the only option. Our research does not condone health workers working unprotected. We recommend that health workers should not work during the COVID-19 pandemic without respiratory protection as a matter of work health and safety. So this author sort of had this old research that suggested something maybe in this one case, but said, no, for COVID-19, you should still wear masks. And if, as if to only make that more clear, they published a follow-up article, Masks in the Community Are an Effective Strategy, where they explain why they think masks in both community and then in other work in hospitals are a good thing for people to wear to prevent COVID-19. And then they even sort of wrote more follow-up articles. This one is particularly interesting because it's a reanalysis of their study in Vietnam. Contamination and washing of cloth masks and risk of infection among hospital health workers in Vietnam. A post hoc analysis of a randomized controlled trial where they set the record straight and suggest some reasons why masks may not actually increase the risk of infection as their original study suggested. They literally wrote over a dozen more papers suggesting that masks are an effective way to prevent COVID-19. But none of that stopped Tucker Carlson from just quoting them out of context anyway. So this is all to say is that the authors want to correct their work. They know it's being misused. They're trying to set the record straight, but for some reason, the systems that we have cannot really get that information out there, seemingly, or we haven't had a good way to sort of fact check the obvious misappropriation of their work. And so we have to think about how to do that going forward. And so thank you. Happy to talk with the rest of the panel, and feel free to reach me at any of these places.
Awesome. Thank you all. All right. It looks like we have our first question already in the chat. Oh, and Rod's been replying to some questions as we go. So thank you for that, Rod. Starting with Peter's question, given the higher amplification of negative stories online and the false consensus driven by influencers, what are the top tips for scientists to help tackle clear misinformation? Whoever wants to can just hop in. It's an easy one, I know.
I guess I can kind of jump in there very quickly. So this is because this is basically something that we talked about in our lab quite extensively, and it also I think ties in very well with Anna's presentation. One thing we were contending with is whether we need to restructure how we write science. So we've seen kind of the way we write papers in general has changed over the years. So we now demand that, a lot of journals demand that, you have a very explicit sort of ethical statement, for example, to describe and, consider any kind of ethical implications of your work. One thing we were talking about within my lab was essentially doing this also with the communication eye. So do we need to essentially start mandating, I suppose, researchers to, also have this blurb that journalists can pick up and they can use to say, this is what the research did. Crucially, this is what the research did not, right? This is kind of what one potential way of approaching this, I guess, from the systemic perspective of doing science. But generally speaking, it's, I think, going to be a very long effort because I think, Anna also picked up on this just now. You have authors disagreeing with people's interpretations of their own work. And we actually saw that quite a bit with certain papers that we analyzed as well. So we did actually have an author posting comments on the preprint server saying, the way you guys are talking about this is not correct. Please stop talking, stop using our paper in this way. And so we need to get in ahead. And that is a very, very difficult thing to do because, as I also said in that presentation at the end, once this kind of story breaks, if you haven't really pre-bunked it, which is difficult to do, you need to predict it, then the damage is already done. So I'm going to stop blabbling and give somebody else the chance to pick it up as well.
I would add to that it's important for scientists to stop thinking of themselves as sort of separate from or above informal communication. So what we're seeing right now is anti-vax doctors, anti-vax scientists, for instance, or science skeptics are very good at communicating to people where they are, right? So on Twitter, also on Substack. Substack's become a real hub of a sort of type of expert misinformer. And I think that it's not inevitable that those voices will just rise to the top. I think there are systems in place that do allow for scientists who have a more mainstream or consensus ideas, right? Like that masks do work, to get their voice out there. And it's not a bad thing to use those outlets. And the other thing I'll say is just that what Anna talked about at the end of their presentation with how different scientists who were on a paper were able to sort of speak or attempt to get their voice out through sort of comments, right, on the paper itself afterwards, or when an editor gives an expression of concern. Those are both public addresses of sorts, and I think should be encouraged, frankly, that things like expressions of concern should be a way in which dialogue can extend after a paper has already been like the results of a paper should not be the final say on the matter. And I think that is interesting that we have mechanisms now like social media that allow that to happen.
I'll maybe sort of chime in on a different angle and say, like, I mean, it's a really difficult problem, right? Like, I have no, I can give as much advice to scientists about how to have their work not be misappropriated as I want, and yet I see the examples from all of our work showing that, like, it sometimes feels almost impossible to prevent. I think one thing I think about a lot is that there's sort of a demand for information which, feeds or maybe confirms our fears, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. That's why conspiracy theories are popular. But the work of making some of the example articles in my paper, for example, that 20-minute video that was really nice animations and all that, that's quite difficult. It requires somebody sort of devoting the most of their life to it. And in certain cases requires, funding to host a website or maybe hire somebody to make that video for you. The point being is that a lot of these sort of anti-mask people, in my case, were essentially social media influencers who, though they may have posed as scientists, their career and their income essentially depends on monetizing their appearances on social media in various different ways. Rod mentioned Substack. That's a great example of scientific misinformers monetizing their practice of creating incredibly detailed, misleading sort of facsimiles of the scientific process and reappropriating scientific work for other things. And so I think scientists need to do as much as they can, and sort of similar to Alex's, to make those statements that makes it easy to correct that work. I also think we have to think from the other angle too. How can we make it harder for people to profit off of misinformation in a really straightforward way? That involves things like content moderation. It involves some sort of standard for social media platforms to say, maybe in the first weeks of the pandemic, we didn't know who was misinforming such and such about who. But for many of the most prominent, pseudoscientific influencers today, they have been saying that vaccines don't work for years. It's really not too hard to show that they have a long history of false information. I believe in one of these presentations, we had a Facebook box saying this person's even been fact-checked as giving false information. How can we cut them off from their income stream so that spending all day and all night working on producing incredibly authentic looking fake science is just not worth it anymore, and they have to get a job instead?
Very well said. And maybe transitions in well to a follow-up question that I had for Alex on the sort of like motives here and the potential that some of this is like coordinated and deliberate. And I'm just curious sort of what your thoughts are and how you're going about looking at this.
I think, Anna gave a really good sort of summary of the problem there. And that is, in fact, that a lot of people are actually profiting off of this. And the way in which they disseminate things aren't always as clear cut. So Rod also presented this image of Rob Malone, I think. And Rob Malone was one of the individuals that actually, he did do quite a bit of work on COVID vaccines, mRNA technology vaccines, right? And he attempted to patent these technologies, but of course, he wasn't the only person that worked on vaccinations, on mRNA vaccine technologies. And so there is still this kind of ongoing narrative that Rob Malone is the creator, of mRNA vaccines, which of course is a bit of an oversimplification. And so I suppose that in terms of, the motivations behind why people, I suppose, spread these kinds of fake science, I think Anna kind of covered that. I think also a really interesting question is the motivations behind why people consume this. And that is another potential attack vector. Of course, it's always best to sort of cut the head off at the source. And, if people are, spreading this kind of fake science for monetary reasons, if we find a way to cut off that income stream, that's fantastic. But a lot of people are also consuming this kind of information because of latent factors, not necessarily because they hate scientists, but because maybe they have a massive distrust towards official institutions in general. And that, I think, also feeds into very often the political climate of a particular country, right? So if there is consistent effort to sort of tear down these official institutions because they're perhaps not serving certain political interests, then it creates a very, very sort of segmented, I would say, two-party system in a sense, right? It creates a very difficult situation because anytime you only have two groups involved in any kind of discourse, it's immediately much, much harder to actually convince somebody of the other side, so to speak. And I assume a lot of people do conceive of this as being the scientists versus the anti-consensus communities. And this is a very long way of saying that in terms of the motivations of why people consume it, I think we do need a lot more research behind that. And we need a lot more research behind what are the potential ways in which we can actually show them that, you're only really doing this because you have a latent distrust towards these institutions.
Yeah, Rod, go ahead.
Oh, no, I didn't have anything else to add. That was well said, though.
Cool. And kind of expanding off of that, maybe into like the political landscape in the US, and how the increasing politicization of science is now influencing the landscape of scientific misinformation, and maybe also tying that to like, recent history and where we've seen dynamics like this before, and who does it serve?
I mean, I think there is, this is building on Alex's point about institutions. There's this idea of science populism, expanded on in a paper by Mead and Schaefer. And I think the idea is that there's increasingly people who see science as an extension of liberal democracy that has been failing them or perceived to be failing society, right? And so a lot of the ideas that begin with conspiracies about the deep state, about elites pulling the strings, extend to scientists, particularly when scientists are sometimes, or rather, when scientific products are sponsored by moneyed interests, right? So, in other words, the big pharma question. The pharmaceuticals are a powerful force in society, but that doesn't mean that pharmaceutical research or vaccines specifically are corrupt. So there are. I think once we get into the sort of the rabbit hole of imagining that everything a scientist produces should have its motivations questioned, you really begin to break down like the force that science can serve for good in society, right? But that's exactly what politicized actors want us to do. And there's a great book that I know and several of us are familiar with, by Oreskes and Conway, Merchants of Doubt, and it essentially documents how tobacco and then various other companies such as oil and gas industries have strategically put out science of their own in order to sort of create counter consensus communities, right? And also question the findings of, for instance, the link between tobacco and cancer by saying, well, other things cause cancer, right? And at the point where you also have media figures that try to try to convince people that there is political bias in science, then it becomes easy for politicized actors or for populist people, for instance, to actually think that scientists are being controlled and that the research is untrustworthy. So I think that understanding this as part of a larger populist idea and a historical moment that's been sort of perpetuated since the 70s of corporate interests taking over is a good way of understanding how politicization can actually continue to mess with scientific results.
And then kind of, well, first of all, it's not a scientist speak up event without a recommendation to read The Merchants of Doubt. So thank you for that, Rod. And just sort of bouncing off of that before we get to the last question, I don't know if this is a question or more of just like, feel free to riff off of this. We've talked a lot about sort of the online dynamics at play here and some of the like offline influences that people have that might lead to their believing the scientific misinformation. But I'm curious if you could expand a little bit more into how this sort of counter consensus misinformation and co-option of science, the consequences that it has beyond Twitter, like how are these things being used in legislatures and the judicial system?
I have a quick one. So I know that there's been a judicial case about mifepristone, which is the abortion drug that is available over the counter, and the Texas courts ruled that it was mifepristone should not be used because it had a sort of possible side effects. But the paper, the sort of scientific basis of this claim that mifepristone, the abortion drug, would cause harms in individuals, was a paper that was later retracted, right? So I am interested personally in knowing, what do we do about bad science that informs important court decisions? Another case that's very salient, the Daily recently had, the New York Times, the Daily, had an episode about how gun lobbying has often, and successful cases that allow guns to be used, often cites two articles from the same professor, and that these articles are actually very poorly, it's bad science, right? Those articles haven't been retracted, but it sounds like they should be at least looked at. But so the larger question of how science can inform particularly pernicious judicial cases and policy in general is an important one. And I think it's one that I want to look at, and maybe others as well.
I'll echo quickly the point about judicial cases. I'm working on a parallel study right now on the use of science, and I know actually a lot of studies already exist on this topic in cases seeking to limit access to transgender healthcare for adults and children. And there's a lot of sort of similar dynamics to that we see in the COVID-19 sort of scientific world happening there. I'll also say, as far as sort of, quote unquote offline consequences, is that sort of rolling out what are sort of online beliefs into maybe school boards or any other sort of place in which is a less contested election, where sort of a quote unquote ordinary person may be able to sort of seek power and put these beliefs that they learned from the internet into practice. And we see a lot of that, particularly on right-wing organizing in the United States. It's often said that maybe the fear of misinformation is overblown because it only affects this sort of small percentage of, poisoned individuals who are super partisans on the internet. But unfortunately, that's also the way our society works, where it only takes a very small percentage of the population to start occupying these minor political positions and other such thing, start really creating large consequences in our life. So.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna read a comment off, and then we'll close with the final question. I'm sorry, we're running a couple of minutes late. I hope that's okay. So the comment from Bob in the chat, and I think this is in response to a conversation with Rod about how papers get retracted. There's nothing in the COPE criteria. COPE stands for the Committee on Public Ethics. Yeah. That refers to flawed assumptions, inadequate adjustment for covariates, potential bias in the data. As a result, most of the bad science is never retracted. This has resulted in some of the worst offenders during COVID. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Rod.
Just so there are retraction guidelines that exist out there. This is what the comment's referring to, but those guidelines are pretty bare bones. And they're not binding, right? So as a result, publishers often kind of do retractions their own way. And so I totally agree that this is a problem, that there are many papers that aren't being retracted because the publishers don't have an incentive to, right? But also because when they are retracted, if they are, that they're not done in a way that seems transparent. And I think transparency is a major issue in science, frankly. So I'll just end on the idea that retractions are complicated, and they haven't been given, I think, the academic attention that they deserve, despite how often academics rely on them in general, right? Or they're not common, but everyone knows a paper that's been retracted, and I think that's because they are significant, they should be treated as such.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we're going to close out with one last question. And so we already talked a little bit about Anna's big question. How can we make our scientific infrastructure more resilient to misinformation? A lot of us in Scientists Speak Up are like graduate students just starting out in the sciences and kind of trying to figure out how we fit into it, any impact that we can have. And I guess I'm curious, like, what is one small thing that we could be doing to have some sort of positive impact in this issue?
I guess I can jump in here. So I think my opinion on this is it might be a bit controversial, I suppose, but it's kind of bouncing off of something that Rod said during the start of the Q&A. So it's this idea that scientists shouldn't really distance themselves from informal communications, and I feel like this a lot of the sentiment behind viewing scientists as elites, this kind of idea that we're part of an establishment that the average person just can't comprehend, may also arise from the fact that we don't really engage in these conversations ourselves. So there's always a medium in between how we communicate our science to other people. So we get interviewed by journalists, we get interviewed by, we appear in these kind of events that may not be accessible or known to the general public. And so one of the, I suppose, roundabouts of that is we should be the ones communicating our science ourselves at the first point of call, and we should be trying to reach as many people as we can doing so. But on the flip side of that, there's also a danger in that we may get targeted as scientists ourselves, and this is also something that people have started to concern themselves with. So if you work in specific areas that seem innocuous, you might still get targeted if somebody decides that this is now an area that's kind of ripe for, I suppose, earning, monetizing. So I guess trying to just get to people, communicate your science to people, but there's also sort of a consideration there that you should really be careful about taking care of yourself as a scientist, because it has turned into a dangerous job in the 21st century, which is weird, but here we are.
I was going to say the exact same thing. That's like, I'm not even kidding. Both that it's important to try to take your public engagement efforts into your hobbies. So talk about science and what you do wherever you are, because I think people really they trust is developed through personal bonds, right? More effectively than these sort of mediated interactions that these celebrity scientists have. Those aren't as strong as the bonds that we can form in our daily practices. But I was also going to say that it is important to keep yourself safe, with certain issues in particular being so contentious right now. There are scientists who are receiving death threats, right? And I mean, that's not okay, but it's also really important to allow yourself the space to I guess get out of the situations if they become bad. So yeah.
All right, Anna, close us out.
I really got no comprehensive plans for what individual scientists should do. It's, the first thing is it's part of a collective effort. Like, I think a lot of the ways through advocacy for sort of a greater regulation of these information environments, adding your voice to people who want to put pressure on social media companies and the people who publish these things is really important. As for just a random little thing you do, if you're sitting at home, like being real mad about some scientific misinformation, there's this weird little niche article, is being misappropriated, but it kind of takes your expertise to know. Maybe make some sort of easily shareable media about it, like create like a little meme, like a screenshot with maybe like an annotation saying like wrong, like it's noticeable that things like images and just things that have a little bit of care put into them. That's why influencers are so good, is they put that care into the media that they create, often sort of bounce around the internet. And it's especially good if it sort of hurts the brand of the people who are talking about these things, like it suggests that they are deceptive, that they are intentionally manipulating these audiences. These things are often a little damaging to them. And you can see that play out in replies where it's quite embarrassing to be confronted with the realization that you are trusting deceptive material. how well that works, studies will need to show. But I think in the meantime, like create something that your friend could share to something else, and just sort of take part in this little information environment, start to become a bit, online, which I think is kind of what other people said. So, yeah.
Awesome. And maybe I'll add one last thing, which is that a lot of these conversations are happening in places that scientists aren't necessarily watching, whether it's like alternative media in like circles that they don't necessarily engage with, or in like really dense amicus briefs to the Supreme Court. And so I have seen cases where scientists' work is being misused. Like if you go into the paper, it doesn't say what people are saying the paper says. But I'm curious how often scientists actually know about that. So, seeing if you can find instances where that happens and potentially letting the authors know, I think can also be helpful. All right, so I don't want to take up any more of your time. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our attendees for joining us, and we will be starting back up again in the fall.